The classroom was a cavernous amphitheater, its polished obsidian walls inscribed with glowing glyphs that chronicled the victories of the Gorvian Empire. Rows of young Gorvian students, their iridescent scales shimmering under the soft bioluminescent lighting, sat upright at their desks, their eyes trained on Professor Virik. The elder Gorvian stood at the center of the room, his posture rigid, his crimson robes of academia flowing like liquid fire. His voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition, filling the hall with a commanding resonance. "Today," Virik began, his tone solemn, "we recount a moment of profound consequence. A day when the Empire, in all its glory, was forced to reckon with a species we once dismissed as inconsequential." He paused, scanning the room. "A species that taught us the price of arrogance." The students shifted uneasily in their seats. Gorvian education rarely dwelled on defeats. Such moments were considered aberrations, blemishes on an otherwise unbroken legacy of dominance. Yet, today's lesson promised to be different. "Professor," a bold student near the front spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism, "surely you don't mean the humans." The word dripped with disdain, as though even speaking of them sullied his pride. "Yes, Saren," Virik replied, his gaze piercing. "The humans, or as our ancestors preferred to call them, the synthetic barbarians." He gestured, and the room darkened. A holographic star map flickered into existence, casting an ethereal glow over the students. A crimson marker pulsed within the Zephra Nebula, an unassuming patch of space where one of the greatest lessons in Gorvian history unfolded. Virik began his tale. In the year 3073, by the Terran calendar, the Empire's Third Fleet encountered a small human expeditionary force near Zephra. Our intelligence had long deemed them unworthy of significant attention. Primitive creatures, dependent on their cybernetic enhancements for survival. They had abandoned their natural bodies in favor of mechanical crutches, sacrificing purity for efficiency. To us, they were an affront to the natural order. The students nodded in agreement, their scales rippling with indignation. "Our fleet," Virik continued, his voice hardening, "consisted of 128 warships, the pride of our armada. They were led by Admiral Sikra, a tactician whose victories were celebrated across the galaxy. Against this force, the humans fielded what?" He allowed the question to hang in the air. A student in the back raised her clawed hand tentatively. "Perhaps 50 ships?" 37. Virik's response elicited a ripple of laughter from the students, but he quickly silenced them with a sharp gesture. 37 human vessels, smaller, less armored, and outnumbered nearly 4-1. To our admirals, it was not a battle. It was a cleansing, a chance to remind the galaxy of Gorvian superiority. He stepped closer to the hologram, manipulating it with a wave of his hand. The map zoomed in, showing the human fleet, a cluster of specks against the vast backdrop of the nebula. "What happened next, Professor?" Saren asked, his earlier skepticism replaced with curiosity. Virik's expression darkened. "What happened, Saren, was unlike anything the Empire had ever encountered." The professor described the opening moments of the confrontation. The Gorvian fleet advanced in their signature wedge formation, a wall of destruction designed to overwhelm and obliterate. The human ships, however, did not engage as expected. "Instead of meeting us head-on," Virik recounted, "they scattered, darting into the dense nebula. To us, it seemed like cowardice. But it was anything but." He gestured again, and the hologram shifted to depict the human fleet's movements. The students leaned forward, watching as the tiny dots of the human ships began to maneuver with unnatural precision. "Each human ship moved as if it were alive," Virik explained. "They did not rely on captains barking orders or officers relaying commands. No, they were connected. Every pilot, every gunner, every system linked through their cybernetic enhancements. They moved as one, a single entity with 1,000 limbs." The Gorvian fleet pursued, but the humans exploited the nebula's dense particle fields to their advantage. They struck with surgical precision, targeting key systems on the Gorvian ships before vanishing into the gas clouds. "I recall watching the battle footage," Virik said, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and bitterness. "Our ships fired in all directions, attempting to lock onto targets that moved faster than our systems could track. It was as though we were fighting ghosts." The students were silent now, their pride giving way to a growing unease. "But surely our fleet adapted," one of them ventured. Admiral Sikra was a brilliant strategist. Indeed she was, Virik replied, and she attempted to adjust. She ordered a full retreat, hoping to regroup and re-establish our formation, but the humans did not allow it. They anticipated her moves as though they could read her thoughts. They struck again and again, dismantling the fleet piece by piece. By the end of the day, the once mighty Gorvian armada was in ruins. Of the 128 warships, only 7 managed to escape. The human fleet, though diminished, emerged victorious. Virik turned to face his class. That day, we learned a painful truth. We had believed ourselves superior because we adhered to tradition, to purity, but the humans showed us the power of adaptation. Their technology was not a crutch. It was an extension of themselves. They were not merely pilots and soldiers. They were their ships, their weapons, their strategy. The students sat in stunned silence, the weight of the story sinking in. This is why we study this battle, Virik concluded, his voice heavy, not to mourn our defeat, but to understand its lessons. For if we refuse to adapt, if we cling to arrogance and disdain, we will not survive the next encounter. As the bell chimed, signaling the end of the lesson, the students filed out, their usual chatter replaced by contemplative silence. Virik remained behind, staring at the hologram of the Zephra Nebula. Perhaps, he muttered to himself, the greatest strength lies not in what we are, but in what we are willing to become. The classroom was darker now, lit only by the pale, shifting glow of the hologram that dominated the room. Professor Virik stood at its edge, a solitary figure against the vast galactic display. The students were transfixed, their earlier confidence shaken. They leaned forward in their seats, the weight of the previous lesson pressing them into silence. Virik waved a clawed hand, and the hologram shifted. The swirling mists of the Zephra Nebula filled the air, its rich blues and silvers casting ghostly patterns across the amphitheater. In its midst floated representations of 2 fleets, the formidable wedge formation of the Gorvian Armada and the scattered, darting shapes of the human vessels. You must understand, Virik began, his voice quieter now, more reflective. The battle that unfolded here was not simply a clash of ships. It was a symphony, and the humans, they were its conductors. The display zoomed in on the first engagement. Gorvian ships, hulking and angular, fired broadside after broadside into the nebula. Energy lances lit up the void, tearing through gas clouds and scattering charged particles in brilliant explosions. But their targets, the human ships, seemed to vanish just before each shot struck. Our fleet operated as it always had, Virik explained. We relied on hierarchical command structures, on precision formations, and overwhelming firepower. But the humans had abandoned such conventions. Their cybernetic connections allowed them to think as one, to act with a unity we could not match. Each pilot was the ship, and the ship was the fleet. The hologram shifted, showing a single human frigate weaving through Gorvian fire. It twisted and spun, dodging shots with impossible agility. Before the Gorvian gunners could adjust, the frigate returned fire, its plasma cannons targeting the Gorvian ship's engines with pinpoint accuracy. The Gorvian vessel faltered, its movements sluggish as it began to drift. They struck with precision, Virik continued. They did not waste energy on grand displays of power. Instead, they crippled us, targeting weak points we thought impervious. They moved with a grace that made our fleet seem clumsy. He gestured again, and the display expanded to show the human fleet moving in concert. They swarmed a Gorvian dreadnought, their ships darting in and out like predators harrying a wounded beast. Each strike was calculated, coordinated. The dreadnought's shields failed, and a concentrated volley from the humans tore it apart in a spectacular explosion. Our response was slow, Virik admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of the memory. Admiral Sikra attempted to adapt. She ordered our ships to break formation, to pursue the humans individually. But this only played into their hands. They lured us deeper into the nebula, into the labyrinth of gas clouds and electromagnetic interference. There, our sensors faltered, our communication lines fragmented. The humans, meanwhile, thrived. The display shifted again, showing the turning point of the battle. A cluster of Gorvian ships, isolated and disoriented, drifted into an ambush. Human vessels appeared from all sides, their weapons lighting up the darkness. In a matter of moments, the Gorvian ships were destroyed. "They fought like predators," Virik said, his tone reverent despite himself. But there was no savagery in their actions. Every move was calculated, every attack precise. It was as though they were following some grand design, a pattern invisible to us. One of the students, a young female named Lysera, raised her claw hesitantly. "Professor," she began, her voice trembling, "how could they predict our movements so easily? Were their ships truly so advanced?" Virik shook his head. Their ships were advanced, yes, but their true advantage lay in their interconnectedness. Each pilot was directly linked to their vessel through neural interfaces. They could process data at speeds we could not comprehend, react faster than any organic mind alone. And because they were linked to one another, they shared information instantaneously. It was not a fleet of individuals, it was a single entity, a hive mind of steel and flesh. The students murmured among themselves, their awe mingling with unease. Virik raised a hand to quiet them. But technology alone does not win battles. No, their victory was as much a result of our arrogance as their ingenuity. We underestimated them, dismissed their methods as unnatural, inferior. We believed our tradition, our discipline, would carry the day. But tradition is a brittle shield against innovation. The hologram displayed the aftermath of the ambush. The Gorvian fleet was in disarray, its once imposing wedge reduced to scattered fragments. Fires raged on crippled ships, and escape pods jettisoned into the void. "And then," Virik said, his voice barely above a whisper, "came the final movement of their symphony." The display zoomed out, revealing the entire nebula. The remaining Gorvian ships attempted to regroup, forming a defensive line near the nebula's edge. But the human fleet did not charge. Instead, they surrounded the Gorvian line, using the nebula's density to mask their movements. "They hemmed us in, cutting off every avenue of escape," Virik said. "And when the final blow came, it was swift. They concentrated their fire on our flagship, Admiral Sykra's vessel. With her gone, our fleet fell into chaos." The hologram showed the flagship exploding in a burst of light, its debris scattering into the void. The remaining Gorvian ships fled, pursued by the relentless humans. Virik turned to face his class, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that silenced the room. The Symphony of Destruction, as we now call it, was not merely a defeat. It was a revelation. The humans showed us the power of adaptation, of unity. They turned what we saw as their weakness, their reliance on technology, into their greatest strength. The students sat in stunned silence, the weight of the lesson pressing down on them. "But remember this," Virik said, his voice rising. "Their victory was not inevitable. It was our failure to adapt, our arrogance, that made it so. Learn from this, or we may find ourselves repeating the same mistakes." As the lecture concluded, the hologram faded, leaving the room in darkness. The students filed out, their usual chatter replaced by hushed whispers. Virik remained behind, his gaze fixed on the spot where the hologram had been. "They are not invincible," he muttered to himself, "but they have become something extraordinary. Perhaps we must become extraordinary too." The amphitheater had grown quiet again, save for the low hum of the environmental controls that regulated the temperature and the soft rustle of students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Professor Virik stood motionless at the center of the room, his crimson robes catching faint light, as if they too bore the weight of the story he had told. The holographic display was gone now, replaced by the plain, unadorned darkness of the lecture hall. "You've heard of our defeat," Virik began, his voice softer than before, almost reflective. "You've seen the precision with which the humans dismantled our fleet, and now we must ask the most difficult question of all." He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. "What does this mean for us?" He turned to the class, scanning their faces. The pride that had once animated them was gone, replaced by furrowed brows and darting eyes. Lysara, the young student who had asked about the humans' neural interfaces, raised her claw again. This time, her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Professor, do you believe we could ever fight them again and win?" Virik considered her question for a long moment. His tail flicked slowly behind him, betraying his inner turmoil. "Perhaps," he replied finally, "but not as we are now." With a wave of his hand, the holographic display returned, though this time it showed not ships or battles, but a series of data streams, charts, equations, and neural patterns. Our analysts have studied the humans extensively since that day, Virik continued. We have dissected their methods, their technologies, their culture, and yet, for all our efforts, one truth remains unavoidable. Their strength lies not only in their machines, but in their willingness to become one with them. The room erupted in murmurs. The very idea was sacrilegious to the Gorvian ethos. For millennia, their culture had celebrated physical and mental purity. To augment oneself, to allow machines to infiltrate one's mind, was considered abhorrent, a betrayal of their natural superiority. "Blasphemy!" Saren exclaimed, rising from his seat. His scales shimmered with outrage. "We are Gorvian. We do not sully ourselves with such abominations." Virik fixed him with a cold, steady gaze. "And that, Saran, is why we lost." The silence that followed was deafening. "Our arrogance, our refusal to adapt, led us to defeat," Virik said, his voice rising. "We believed ourselves above change, above innovation. We saw the humans as weak because they embraced what we feared. But tell me, Saran, who emerged victorious? Who survives today because they chose to evolve, while we stagnated?" Saran sank back into his seat, his defiance replaced by uncertainty. Virik seized the moment. "This is the lesson of the Zephra Nebula," he said, addressing the entire class. "It is not simply a tale of ships and battles. It is a lesson in humility, in the necessity of growth. If we continue to cling to the past, to our rigid notions of purity, we will not survive the next encounter with the humans, or with any species willing to embrace the future." Lysara spoke again, her voice cautious. "Do you believe we should become like them? Integrate ourselves with machines?" Virik sighed. "I do not know what path the Empire will choose, but I do know this. The galaxy will not wait for us. Change is inevitable, and if we do not adapt, if we do not evolve, we will be left behind." The hologram shifted once more, displaying the aftermath of the battle. The wreckage of the Gorvian fleet floated in the void, a haunting reminder of their hubris. Amid the debris, human ships moved with quiet efficiency, recovering their own wounded and salvaging their technology. "Even in victory, the humans demonstrated something we could not comprehend at the time," Virik said. "They did not revel in their triumph. They did not seek to humiliate us or claim glory. They simply moved forward. To them, the battle was not an end, but a step in their ongoing evolution." The students watched in silence, the weight of the scene pressing down on them. Virik turned to face them one final time. "Remember this. Strength is not static. It is not an inherent quality to be preserved. True strength lies in the ability to adapt, to overcome, to embrace the unknown. That is the lesson of the humans, and it is the lesson we must learn or we will perish." As the lecture ended, the students filed out slowly, their usual energy replaced by a solemn quiet. For the first time, they seemed to carry the weight of their empire's mistakes, the burden of its future. Virik remained behind, gazing at the empty room. His claws traced the edge of the holographic console absently as his thoughts drifted. Outside the window, the faint light of distant stars glimmered against the void. Somewhere out there, humanity was moving forward, ever evolving, and the Gorvian Empire? Virik could only hope they would find the courage to do the same.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing.